Hello everyone and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James and welcome to the very last list for List Season 2020. We're finally getting them all done, and of course my last list was the worst movies of 2020, and this one is coming very soon after it, the best movies of 2020. Now, I'm going to be talking about my 10 favorite movies of 2020, of course, and like I said in my last video, much like music, I do feel that movies had a really good year this year, and it was an interesting challenge this year trying to stay on top of movies, especially with how very uncommon this year was. I turned a lot more to streaming than I had in past years, and I had to go a lot more creative in trying to research what movies I needed to watch, and that made me find a lot of interesting movies this year. A lot that I probably would have never paid attention to in the past, with only seeing some big releases and maybe certain indie releases. This year, I think I saw a pretty good combination of small and big budget films, so you'll see that reflected in my top 10. But let's not waste any more time and get started with number 10. This was a movie I only saw a couple weeks ago, and the fact that it cracked my top 10 so quickly is significant. In fact, I feel like if I had seen this movie a longer time ago and had given it more time to be in my thoughts and resonate with me even more, it might even be higher in my top 10. But still, this movie more than deserves this place in my top 10 in my opinion. Wolfwalkers is an absolutely gorgeous movie. One of the most beautiful animated movies I've seen this year. It's not often that you see a whole lot of 2D animation out there these days. A lot of times animation studios are emphasizing more on 3D. That's just what the form is now. So whenever I see a 2D animated movie, I don't take it for granted. And this one was certainly something special. The animation in this one was just something to behold. It felt really nostalgic, and it just constantly caught your eye every second. Also, I really liked the fairy tale feel of this movie. It really did a good job of transporting you into another world, while also making the story feel very grounded and very much so human and relatable. The main characters in this movie, all of them were great in my opinion. They were all relatable, and they were all people that you could easily attach onto. Robin was an excellent main character. I just loved seeing her grow and seeing her learn some very important things that I think are good messages to ingrain into children. And man, what this movie does in terms of its emotional arc is really powerful to me. This movie really does a good job at being understated and delivering its emotional depth, and you can just feel the vulnerability of these characters. I love seeing child characters that express their emotions in a very vulnerable and very powerful way. There were a lot of just great scenes here where you could feel the emotion amping up, and that was also due in part to all the great voice actors here, especially Sean Bean. Overall, the combination of Wolfwalkers' wonderfully endearing story, along with its great characters and powerful mystical elements, created a world that I was just endlessly enraptured by and wanted to constantly return to. So I think this movie warrants a lot of repeat viewings. Almost everything about this movie works. I don't have many problems with it. It is an excellent animated film, and I'm definitely going to be looking out for more from this studio. I know they have a lot of movies in their back catalog, and I'm going to be checking them out, but I can't wait to see what this studio has for the future if this is the type of caliber of movies they are producing. Mangrove is one of 5 movies in a Small Axe miniseries that Steve McQueen did for Amazon Prime, and man was this one excellent. It tells the story of the Mangrove Nine, a group of people who went on trial after they were pretty much unjustifiably attacked by the Metropolitan Police in what were clearly racially motivated attacks. And the movie is a clear commentary on how people of color have been repeatedly mistreated by cops and by the establishment, and ultimately it's an inspiring story of people fighting to try and keep their power and keep their hope alive. There are so many just great characters in this movie that help bring it along too. All the main characters in this are wonderful, and each of them have an inspiring story to tell, and I think each and every one of them gets a moment to shine. For me, though, it's probably Letitia Wright who really shines the brightest in this movie. She has a monologue that I feel like is the main thesis of this movie, and I really like the message she delivers in it. That even though things may not change for these people now, that they're ultimately fighting for this for future generations. The movie doesn't ever hit you over the head in obnoxious ways with this message, instead just showing you what happens and letting you come to the conclusions for yourself. And I just sort of appreciate how they let the characters live in this movie sometimes. I like how they let the characters just talk with each other sometimes, and we can feel the character relationships building very naturally in that regard. And I like how the movie just so uncomfortably transitions into these dark moments. They put you on the edge of your seat, and there's hardly a time when you're expecting them. They're oftentimes very sudden and just very frightening to behold. And I can't even imagine how the people were feeling in real time if I'm feeling terrified as a spectator watching it. Steve McQueen does his best to put you in these characters' shoes and to feel their pain, feel their fury, and you feel that. You feel that anger at them being unjustifiably targeted for no real good reason. And I also even felt that the trial scenes were really good. Oftentimes, trial movies are not my thing because I feel like there's not much you can do with that formula now, but Steve McQueen really proved me wrong by making the trial scenes pretty interesting. He makes them go on as long as they need to, not overstaying their welcome, and also makes each scene purposeful, interesting, and have a real impact to it. Mangrove was a wonderful film that was just beautifully directed and wonderfully acted from front to back. Corey Finley shows himself to be a great director yet again on Bad Education, a decidedly different movie from Thoroughbreds, but still a great one all the same, about Principal Frank Tassone in the Roslyn School District, and how he had to face head-on a school scandal, and we eventually discover, as the layers are unfolded, that he had quite the part to play in it. I don't want to reveal exactly what part he has to play, but it's just really interesting to see it continue to unfold. Bad Education is about a lot of things. It's about the corruption of a school district. It's about how if we let certain powers go unchecked, then they will continue to corrupt. It's about how we don't keep certain people accountable that we should. But more than anything else, Bad Education is actually a character study, interestingly enough. It has all these important messages going on in it for sure, but more than anything, it studies Frank Tassone as a character, which I find very interesting. This character is not, of course, entirely likable, and as we discover more and more about him, the more dark layers are revealed about him. As we see more about him, we see that his desire to be liked by others is fueled by some darker motivations too, almost a selfish desire more than anything else. And it's really interesting to see those layers continue to be unfolded in some pretty uncomfortable but also oftentimes blackly comedic ways, as he will do anything to cover up scandals at the school in order to keep his reputation intact. This is all anchored by a wonderful performance by Hugh Jackman, who just impresses on every level in this movie. The other performances in this film are great as well. Allison Janney does a great job as Pam Cluckin, the one who sort of ignites this whole scandal because she was the one who was being the most obvious in being involved in the scandal. And even her, Allison Janney, does a great job at making us understand maybe why she did this, because she wanted to provide for her family. Ray Romano is also great in this movie. I think he uses his comedic talents to great effect here, actually playing it a bit more subtle than I would have expected from him. And it is a really interesting thing to watch. And also, Rachel Bhargava is a great character as well, the one who sort of works to uncover the stuff going behind the school. And while I do wish they had focused on her story a little bit more, because she was sort of the one trying to expose everything, it was still interesting to watch what scenes they did have with her and to see her struggling to see the school as a corrupt establishment, the place that she'd grown to love being in. Bad Education was darkly funny, very witty, well written, and incredibly well acted. Definitely one of the most fun movies of the year and one of the most interesting by far. Deeply unsettling and powerfully metaphorical, Relic ended up being one of my favorite horror films of the year. I did say in my original review of Relic that I actually liked the horror movie Invisible Man better, but as I've thought about it more, I realized that wasn't really true for me. I said in my original review of Relic that it was the scariest horror movie I saw this year, and I still stand by that. And it's only about an hour and a half runtime. This movie never once lets up on the tension for the most part. Robin Nevin as Edna is just a star performance here. She does an absolutely excellent job at showing in tragic but also horrifying detail how this character is slowly losing herself to Alzheimer's, which this movie portrays as a very monstrous, literally monstrous disease that makes her dehumanized. And I think that's actually a sort of appropriate touch. The movie doesn't ever treat it like a joke or treat it like something that's a cheap scare by any means. Emily Mortimer as Kay, the mother character of the film, is the one who centers all these emotions in very powerful ways. You can feel her sorrow, her anger, her very conflicted emotions about her mother. And you can feel the conflicted feelings in her as she's trying to navigate how to take care of her as she doesn't even know who she is anymore. And that leads me to the next part of this movie, which is the scares. The scares are excellent in this movie. I feel like they do a great job at holding back on the cliched scares that we would come to expect and instead building up some really great tension here. There are a lot of moments where I was on the edge of my seat because of the white-knuckled tension, especially in the climactic moments of this film. But what really surprised me about this film more than anything else was how touching of an ending it had. If there's any film I could compare this to, it would be The Babadook, where they're using something in real life and making it like a horror metaphor in this movie. And this one's very similar to The Babadook in that regard. And also similarly to that movie, there's a redemptive ending to it. They find a way to essentially deal with this thing that Edna is going through, this horrible thing that's making her lose her sense of self. It's just a beautiful ending to me, and really nailed this movie for me as being certainly one of my top 10 favorite films of the year. Though this movie ended up being a little lower on my list than I expected, I still definitely loved Tenet. Now, I know a lot of people had conflicted feelings on this film from Christopher Nolan. Some people definitely thought it was almost too Christopher Nolan-y, which I can sort of see. Even with that, I still did really enjoy this movie and enjoyed the high concept it had. I thought it was really interesting, and it was helped by the interesting characters. I thought the protagonist of this movie, that's literally his name, was a fun character to follow around and to get to know. And I appreciate that they actually kept some aspects of his character a mystery. I think it's underrated to not know everything about your protagonist. A lot of people seem to like to know literally everything about the main character and to feel entirely connected to them, but sometimes I think it's actually okay to not feel entirely connected to your main character. Actually, the character we can attach more easily to is Robert Pattinson's character. Now, maybe it's just because I'm very biased to Robert Pattinson as an actor these days. He only seems to be getting better and better. But Neil is the more interesting character here and the one that has more stuff going on, it seems, at least. And I think that's intentional because Christopher Nolan doesn't necessarily want us to understand everything about the protagonist. So Neil is more of the character that we're learning a lot about, and I think it's interesting to do it from that perspective. Also, the villain here, I think he's great. Kenneth Branagh does a really good job as a villain. I appreciate that Christopher Nolan makes a villain that's not necessarily the most subtle out there, that is just very obviously a villain. We don't see that all the time in movies these days, and I sort of like that every once in a while. It can feel refreshing to have a villain that is just so obviously bad. And then there's, of course, the concept at the center of the movie. And I think Christopher Nolan does a lot of interesting things with it, with these characters having the ability to go either forward or backward in time, and we don't ever know which one they're doing sometimes. In fact, it becomes more and more twisted as the movie goes on in a sort of Inception-style fashion, but I really liked the action sequences that they were able to film with this. Christopher Nolan does such a good job at using as much naturalistic effects as he can with his action, and you can tell he's doing that once again here. He's very methodical with his action sequences. They feel very purposeful. With its high concept and overall great performances, as well as just the intriguing mysteries that built up in this movie, I think Tenet is something that you can return to several times to try to continue to unpack the layers of it. I think that's its biggest strength, and I definitely plan on returning to it more. This is maybe not one of Christopher Nolan's best, but it's still one that I really appreciate. Who knew that The Lonely Island would be so good at making movies? But I guess it sort of makes sense because they made some really good parody songs. And while I really liked Pop Star Never Stop, Never Stopping for all of its sheer ridiculousness, I think Palm Springs works a little better as a film. Now, this film's plot arc might sound very familiar, where these characters are stuck in a time loop of experiencing the same event, the same day, over and over and over again. I think this movie does a good job at providing a bit of a twist to the concept and making it almost like a sci-fi comedy in a way, which is just really interesting to me. There's so many things to like about this movie, and I think the most primary is the romantic chemistry between Anthony Samberg and Kristen Melody. Both of their characters are just excellent, and both of them have their own interesting things going on with their characters. And you just endlessly root for this relationship. It's impossible not to. They're just such a fun couple, and it's just fun to watch them on screen together. Also, J.K. Simmons has a surprisingly great role in this film. I wasn't expecting him to be in this movie, and I didn't know he was even a part of it, but his character is just delightful in this, and it's really interesting what they do with him as well. Palm Springs is just a really fun romantic comedy. Simple as that. And the interesting twists it has on its concept help lift it even further for me. This one's just great, and it's an easy one to return to, in my opinion, just for its sheer fun factor. Pixar has struck gold yet again with Soul. While it may not be as good as recent films like Inside Out or Coco, it still comes awfully close for me. I did really like this movie after I finished watching it, but I found that with this one, the more I thought about it, the more I appreciated what it was doing. At its core, this movie actually has a pretty simple message that the purpose of life is to just live. This movie is not about death, it's about life. Even though a lot of the movie takes place with main character Joe being essentially dead, it's all about how he's missed parts of his life. And it's just really interesting to watch the journey he goes on, how he starts to realize how he's missed parts of his life. And the movie does so in such a powerful way to where it just feels very natural. Pixar has always done a good job at not ever hammering their messages over your head, and instead doing so in a very charming and very beautiful way. This movie does it in a way that I feel is very intellectually interesting to me. Some say this movie isn't a children's movie, and I honestly can see where they're coming from, especially in the high concepts that this movie has. There's some things that are almost certainly going to go right over children's heads, but I also think that something another YouTuber pointed out, I can't remember the YouTuber's name, but I'll have to find it if I can remember it, but something another YouTuber pointed out is that some people are making 22's character arc go underrated, the sort of unborn soul that Joe mentors in the movie. And 22 very much so seems like a kid character, if anything else. And a lot of kids are going to be able to relate to 22 in ways that I didn't even consider at first. Like, the fact that she doesn't know what she wants to do in life, the fact that she's very undecided, the fact that she doesn't even want to really tackle life head on because she's scared of it. I think a lot of kids might relate to that, and maybe even if they don't want to admit it, they might still say those things. And that's just an interesting thing to think about. While this movie may not be the most kid-friendly Pixar movie out there, I still think it can appeal to kids all the same. And, I mean, at the end of the day, Pixar still knows how to deliver redemptive messages that are fit for the whole family, so that is worth it for this movie alone. But what really blew me away about this movie was its animation style. What really brings this movie over the top in terms of animation is that there's some really unique animation styles that Pixar has literally never used before. Very abstract art in some ways, and how they portray some of the Soul characters, and there's just some animation here that feels very surrealistic as well. And it's just not an animation style that Pixar has ever done before. This one will always stand out for that reason. It's one of the best animated movies that Pixar has ever done, and there's certain sequences in here that are among their best animated to date. Soul is an excellent film from Pixar and shows that even this late into their game, they have not lost their touch. Not by any means. Body horror is not usually my thing. I'm usually not the type of person who enjoys gore movies, not because I can't stomach them, although that can sometimes be the case, but more often because I just feel like gore is not that scary. It's only done for shock value usually, and it's not even that interesting of shock value, but Possessor really proved me wrong in how it used its body horror. This movie's plot arc is just so interesting to me and so mind-bending as we follow this agent who takes on other people's bodies in order to carry out bounty missions where she's essentially killing high-profile people disguised as other people. So these people that she's possessing, they get arrested for the crime and she doesn't. And it's a really eerie concept to me. The plot gets more mysterious when she finally possesses someone who almost seems to be aware that he's being possessed, and eventually we realize that he is in fact aware. And eventually there becomes a battle for his body, where we start to wonder the actions that he's doing. Are they his, or are they the agents that possesses him? And it's a really interesting mind-bending of seeing who's really in control. Are we in control of anything we do? The kills in this movie, the gore in this movie, is just legitimately unsettling to me. And it's even more unsettling when you start to think of who's doing them and what motivation they have to do them. I love the mystery aspect of this movie. That really lifts it up so much. And just the pure visual style of this movie, for as terrifying and ugly as it can purposefully look sometimes, there's also moments where it's almost mind-bendingly beautiful. This is, in my opinion, the best horror movie or thriller movie I saw this year. Easily. This movie deserves your attention because it went very, very underrated. I did not expect the emotional journey that this movie gave me, but I'm so glad that I gave it the chance to take me there. Sound of Metal is about a drummer who, of course, drums for a metal band with his girlfriend Lou, and he eventually starts to lose his hearing, and he eventually becomes totally deaf, and he basically has to abandon his whole life, everything that he's known, and join a deaf community and learn to adapt to this new way of life. This is an often heartbreaking movie, but also very often an inspiring one. And I think that almost entirely rides on the shoulders of Riz Ahmed's incredible performance as Ruben. Riz Ahmed seems like a very dedicated actor to me. I read what he did for this movie in preparation for it, such as the fact that he actually spent time with the deaf community. You can tell he's just dedicated, and he really cared about this role. He puts his all into it. And he never once lets the emotion of this movie, the central emotional arc, become melodramatic or over the top. All the emotion feels very real here because of how Riz Ahmed portrays it. And yeah, he has to go through the grief process here. And I think Riz Ahmed does a great job at navigating each aspect. I also don't think Olivia Cooke should go unnoticed here either, as she plays her character very beautifully. And it's interesting where Lou as a character goes. It's not exactly what you expect, but it's still an interesting arc all the more, and she's also just a wonderful character to follow. And I really liked her journey as well. It was equally as touching to me. I also have to say that the representation of the deaf community in this movie was just really cool to me. You don't see this happening all the time in films where a community like this gets a whole lot of attention, but I loved how this movie just paid so much respect to them. Sound of Metal isn't a movie about music. it's not even really a movie about losing hearing. It's actually a movie about accepting something that is very tragic, but finding ways to grow from it and to move on and still try to live life the best way you can. And that's just a beautifully human message to me. I really hope this movie gets some recognition at the Oscars because I think it would be absolutely criminal if it didn't. Oh, wow, wow, wow. Every time I think about this movie, it just still never fails to amaze me. I've never actually read the book that this movie is based on, but I know I need to now. I've heard that the book is very different from the movie, but I'm very intrigued in it, of course. I'm Thinking of Ending Things is just undoubtedly my favorite movie of the year. Nothing came close to it. I'm Thinking of Ending Things is about a woman who decides to essentially end things by breaking up with her boyfriend Jake. Although there's some more darker implications to ending things as we get later into the movie, but I don't want to spoil that. The movie title has a lot of interpretations for it, but that initial plot arc leads to a lot of interesting things going on as she meets Jake's family, and eventually starts to realize that the family is aging in very weird ways, and that there's clearly more going on underneath the surface than what we are seeing. This movie uses Oklahoma the Musical as its central emotional arc, which was not really something I was expecting, but it works incredibly well. And I mean, that's mainly due to Jesse Plemons' just mind-blowingly good performance. He's such a great actor and one that I feel is very underrated, considering just how much range this guy has. He can play a lot of different types of roles. His character's journey is just so heartbreaking, but also just relatable in terms of what he's going through and in terms of what he's feeling about the sum of his own life. And you feel that too. You wonder if your life at the end of the day has had much meaning sometimes, and that's just a deeply and uncomfortably relatable character arc to go through, so it's very powerful to watch. There's so much more I could say about this movie, but I just feel like you need to see it for yourself to truly understand just all the great stuff this movie has in it. There's so much powerful content in here, and I really think it's one that you have to witness for yourself. Give it a chance. You may not truly understand it at first, because I certainly didn't. I had to think about it a lot. But once you do, I think you've got a truly wonderful and powerful film on your hands. So yeah, those were my top 10 best movies of 2020. What were your best films of 2020? Let me know in the comments below. And yeah, that finally ends list season. Thank you to all of you who are sticking along. I know it was a little bit rough around the edges. I'm still getting into the swing of things, and I even think my movies lists were a little rougher than my my music lists, but that's okay. I'll start to get the hang of it more and more, and hopefully make it even more organized in the future. But be on the lookout for either an individual movie review or an individual music review coming very soon. Until then, I will see you all in the next video.